For 2 centuries, one formation ruled the ancient world, a wall of men, 16 ranks deep, unbroken, unmatched. The Phalanx, the weapon of Alexander the Great. It conquered kingdoms, crushed empires, and made Greece the heart of the ancient world. But every empire believes it will never fall, until the day it does. On a fog-covered hill in Thessaly, that day came. The Romans arrived, not in shining armor, but in silence and precision. They did not stand still. They moved. They adapted. They learned. And when the rigid wall of the Phalanx met the living mind of the legion, history itself broke apart. The spears of Alexander met the iron of Rome, and the age of Greece ended in the sound of marching boots. From that day on, the world would fight, build, and rule the Roman way. Their legions crossed mountains, rivers, and seas. They burned cities, they broke kings, they silenced continents. The thunder of their advance rolled across Europe for centuries. And even long after the empire was gone, the world still remembered the day when the unbreakable finally fell, and Rome learned how to make the world kneel. For 200 years, the ghost of Alexander the Great had haunted every Greek king. Each of them dreamed of matching his greatness, but none ever could. By 197 BC, that dream was fading. The proud kingdom of Macedon had lost its shine, and its king, Philip V, was running out of time. Philip still carried the old fire of Macedonia, the spirit of conquest, the pride of the Phalanx. He wanted to bring Greece back under his rule, to make his people great again. But the world had changed, and from across the sea another power was coming. Rome. Rome did not fight for glory or legend. Rome fought for order, for control, for the idea that the world should bend to its will. They had already crushed mighty Carthage in the west, and now they looked east, toward Greece. Leading them was a young commander, Titus Quinctius Flamininus. He was only in his early 30s, but his mind was sharp and his ambition sharper. He promised the Greeks freedom, but Roman freedom often came wrapped in chains. When his legions landed on Greek soil, the city-states watched carefully. They had seen conquerors before, Persians, Macedonians, tyrants of every kind. But the Romans were different. They spoke softly, offered alliances, and fought with terrifying precision. One by one, the Greek cities began to turn away from Philip, choosing Rome over their own king. By the spring of 197 BC, Philip had no choice. He gathered what was left of his army, 26,000 men, veterans of the great Phalanx, men who had trained their whole lives to fight shoulder to shoulder, their long spears, the sarissas, stretching out like a wall of silver. Flamininus marched north with 25,000 soldiers of his own. Roman legionaries and their Greek allies. They were not noblemen. They were farmers, blacksmiths, ordinary men turned into professional killers. Each fought not for a king, but for the Republic, for discipline, for the power of Rome itself. Between them lay the hills of Thessaly, covered in cold morning fog. The locals called them Cynoscephalae, the dogs' heads. It was rough ground, uneven and broken, a terrible place for the Macedonian Phalanx to fight. But war never waits for perfect ground. And that morning, as the mist began to move, so did destiny. The morning mist clung to the hills like smoke from 1,000 unseen fires. Neither side could see the other, but both could feel the tension in the air, that strange stillness before the first arrow flies. Philip's army was tired. They had marched through the night, heavy armor scraping, bronze shields knocking together in the dark. The king himself rode ahead, scanning the ridges, searching for a place where the ground was even enough for his phalanx to form its deadly wall of spears. He was proud, stubborn, and desperate. For this battle, he knew, would decide not just his crown, but the future of all Greece. Flamininus, on the other hand, waited in silence. He was cautious, not afraid, but calculating. The fog was thick, rolling between the hills like a living thing. He ordered his men to hold their ground and sent small groups of scouts ahead. What he didn't know was that Philip had done the same. Two forces, both blind in the mist, moving closer and closer without realizing how near they already were. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A Roman scouting party stumbled upon Macedonian light infantry. For a heartbeat, both sides froze. Then the air exploded with shouting, clashing steel, and the sharp whistle of javelins. The fog turned red. The sound carried through the valley, echoing off the hills like thunder. Neither Philip nor Flamininus could see what was happening, but the cries told them everything. The battle had begun before either side was ready. Philip, fearing that his scouts were being crushed, ordered his right wing forward. Thousands of phalangites lowering their sarissas in a deadly rhythm, their formation gleaming like a silver forest in motion. The earth trembled as they advanced, but on the left side of his line, chaos reigned. The hills were too steep, the fog too thick. The other half of the phalanx struggled to climb the slope, their long spears catching on rocks and bushes, their perfect wall beginning to fracture. Flamininus saw the chance, or rather, felt it. He didn't have full sight of the battlefield, but the Romans didn't need perfect vision. They were trained to adapt, to break their enemy piece by piece. He ordered the legion on his right to move forward, to meet Philip's oncoming wall head-on. The clang of shields meeting spears filled the air. The Phalanx pushed hard, its front ranks forcing the Romans back step by step, the weight of their formation almost unstoppable. For a moment, it seemed that Macedonia might actually win. The long spears pierced through Roman armor, men screamed, blood soaked the mud, and the Phalanx kept moving forward like a single living beast. But the Romans did not break. Instead, they bent, shifting, reforming, each small unit moving on its own command, finding openings in the enemy line. A legion was not one wall, it was 1,000 small minds working together. And somewhere in that mist, one Roman centurion, his name lost to history, looked to his left and saw the Macedonian flank hanging open. Without waiting for orders, he made a decision that would change the course of the battle. He led his men around the hill, striking at the exposed side of the Phalanx. In that moment, the balance of the world began to tip. At first, no one realized what had happened. The battle was chaos, fog, blood, shouting, nothing but noise and motion. But somewhere on the right flank, the Roman centurion's gamble had turned the tide. While Philip's men pressed forward on one hill, the Roman legion on the opposite slope curved around the Macedonian line like a blade finding its mark. From the fog emerged red cloaks and glinting iron, not retreating Romans, but a silent storm, moving fast and low. The Macedonian soldiers didn't see them until it was too late. Phalanx formations were strong from the front, but from the side they were helpless. Their long sarissas could not turn fast enough. Before they could react, Roman short swords, gladii, were already cutting through armor and flesh. The tight ranks that had once conquered the world began to fall apart. A spear wall is only invincible when it stays straight, but once it bends, it dies. The Romans moved like water, flowing between gaps, hacking at knees, shoulders, and exposed backs. The Macedonian shouts turned from confidence to panic. The sound of sarissas snapping filled the air, like dry branches breaking underfoot. Philip, from his position on higher ground, watched in disbelief. He saw his right wing still pushing forward, believing victory was theirs, while his left was collapsing, crushed, torn apart, disappearing into the mist. He shouted for messengers. None returned. The fog swallowed voices, orders, hope. Flamininus saw the confusion and acted with the cold precision that made Rome feared across the world. He ordered his left wing forward, turning the small Roman victory into a full-scale encirclement. Now the Macedonian phalanx was fighting on two sides, its front locked in combat, its flank bleeding out under the gladius. What began as a steady advance turned into a nightmare. The men in the back couldn't see the front. They kept pushing, forcing their own comrades forward into Roman blades. The Phalanx, once a perfect machine, had become a trap for itself. Roman horns sounded through the mist. Their rhythm was steady, calm, almost cruel. Each note meant a new maneuver. Each signal a new tightening of the noose. The legions moved as one body. Shields slammed forward, swords stabbed in short, brutal motions. There was no elegance, no art, just efficiency, rhythm, death. The ground was slick with mud and blood. Men slipped, fell, and never rose again. The cries of Alexander, that once echoed across continents, now turned into screams for mercy. Philip's horse reared as arrows hissed overhead. He tried to rally his men, but everywhere he looked, the Phalanx, the pride of Macedonia, was gone. It was no longer a formation, just fragments of men fighting for survival. He hesitated, a king's pride against the certainty of death. Then finally he ordered the retreat. Those words, retreat, ended 2 centuries of Macedonian glory. Flamininus did not chase far. He watched as the fog lifted and the field revealed its truth. Thousands of Macedonian corpses, their long spears broken, their helmets lying face down in the mud. For Rome, it was not just a victory, it was a demonstration. The world had seen it. The Phalanx, the greatest weapon of the ancient world, had met its end on a nameless hill in Thessaly. And from that day on, no army in the world would ever fight the same way again. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the battlefield looked like the end of the world. The fog that had hidden the fighting now revealed what war truly was. A landscape of broken spears, scattered shields, and bodies that would never rise again. The crows came first, then the wind. It blew across the hills of Cynoscephalae, carrying with it the smell of iron and smoke. No song, no victory shout, just the sound of boots on wet ground and the quiet breathing of the living. Flamininus rode among the fallen. His armor was spattered with blood, not all of it his enemies. He looked at the field in silence, at the men who had fought so fiercely for a dream already dying. The Macedonians had come to defend their way of war, the way of Alexander. But that way had ended here, in mud and fog. The world had changed, and Rome was its new language. Philip V had escaped, taking with him what remained of his army. A few thousand men too shocked to understand they had lost more than a battle. They had lost the idea that Greece could still stand apart from Rome. In the days that followed, Flamininus sent word across the land. He called it a message of peace, but every Greek city heard it for what it was, a declaration of dominance. When he entered Corinth, then Delphi, then Athens, he spoke to the people in words that made them cheer. Greece, he said, is free, free from kings, free from tyrants, free to live as she once did. The crowd erupted. Men shouted, women threw flowers. The temples rang with praise. For a moment it felt like the glory of old had returned. But those who looked closer could see the truth. The Roman banners still hung over the gates, and Roman soldiers still watched from the walls. Freedom, it seemed, now wore a Roman face. Flamininus meant his words. At least, he believed he did. He admired Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek art. But admiration is not equality. Rome gave Greece back its cities, but took away its soul. In taverns and temples, people whispered, the Romans came as friends and stayed as masters. The Greek poets wrote songs of victory, but in their verses, the heroes no longer wore armor. They wore chains of silver, gilded and beautiful, but chains nonetheless. Flamininus returned to his camp that night and looked out over the hills. Fires burned in the distance where the dead still lay unburied. The wind whispered through the grass like voices of those who would never speak again. He had given Greece its freedom, but deep down he knew the truth. Rome did not give freedom. Rome replaced it. The silence that followed the Battle of Cynoscephalae was not peace. It was the sound of an old world ending. History does not end with battles. It echoes, sometimes for centuries. And the echo of Cynoscephalae carried across the ancient world like a warning that the age of Greece had ended and the age of Rome had begun. News of the victory spread quickly. Messengers rode from city to city, bringing word that Philip had been defeated, that the mighty Phalanx, the weapon of Alexander, had been broken by men with shorter swords. To the Romans, it was proof that their way was superior, their training, their discipline, their system. The legion was not born from heroes, but from structure. It was the machine of empire, and Cynoscephalae had proven that the machine could crush glory itself. In Rome, senators celebrated, priests sacrificed white bulls to Jupiter, and poets praised Flamininus as the liberator of Greece. But across the Aegean, the feeling was different. In the markets of Athens and the temples of Sparta, men spoke in low voices, unsure whether to cheer or mourn. The victory that freed Greece also chained her to a new master. For centuries, the Greek phalanx had symbolized order. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, each trusting the man beside him, their strength found in unity. But the legion was something else. It was not a wall. It was motion. It was adaptation. It was war made logical. The Greeks had fought for glory. The Romans fought for purpose. And purpose, in the end, always wins. Years passed. Philip remained on his throne, but his kingdom was a shadow of itself. He swore loyalty to Rome, sending tribute and hostages to ensure peace, including his own son, Perseus, who would one day rise against Rome and fall as his father did. Meanwhile, Rome grew stronger. They studied every battle, every victory, every failure. They learned from Greece, its tactics, its culture, its art, and then they made all of it their own. Greek generals wrote of courage. Roman commanders wrote of efficiency. From the ashes of Greece's greatness, Rome built something colder, but longer lasting. An empire of laws, not legends. Of roads, not myths. Of armies that could move anywhere, fight anyone, and endure anything. The philosophers of Athens wrote about fate. The Romans called it duty. Both meant the same thing, inevitability. The echo of Cynoscephalae was heard far beyond Thessaly. It reached the halls of Carthage, where generals began to fear Rome's unstoppable advance. It reached the courts of Syria and Egypt, where kings whispered of alliances that could never hold. And it reached the heart of every soldier who still believed in old ways, telling them that time itself was now Rome's ally. No empire ever truly dies in one day, but every empire has a moment when it begins to fade. For Greece, that moment was Cynoscephalae. The spears of Alexander had pierced the world, but at last the world had learned how to pierce back. And somewhere beneath those quiet Thessalian hills, among the rusting spears and shattered helmets, the echo of that day still lingers, the sound of an age ending and another taking its place. Flamininus returned to Rome as a hero. Statues were raised, songs were written, and his name was etched into history. But even he could not have imagined that his victory at Cynoscephalae was not the end of a war, but the beginning of an empire that would outlast time itself. Within a century, Rome would rule all of Greece. Within 2, it would rule the Mediterranean. And within 5, it would rule the world that once belonged to Alexander. Yet for all its glory, Rome too would one day hear its own echo fade. For every sun that rises must also set. And perhaps in that distant future, as new powers rise from the dust of old ones, they too will look back at Cynoscephalae and understand what it truly meant. That power alone does not define greatness. That victory carries its own curse, and that every empire, no matter how mighty, must one day stand where Philip once stood, on a hill, watching the fog roll in, wondering if the age of his world has just ended. Because history does not stop, it only changes hands. And in that endless turning, the hills of Cynoscephalae still whisper their lesson to the wind. That every age of conquest ends not with a roar, but with silence.